Well, welcome back to another conversation here at the ICSDP. And I'm going to just double check this to get this right, but it's THEICSDP.org. That's where you can find out more about this initiative. You can find out more about some of the people involved and listen to some of these conversations. And we're about to step into another one of those conversations with Dr. Gloria Novović. She's here with us from the School for Government from King's College in London. Gloria, thanks so much for joining me on, I was going to say the show, but really I think I've said this before. It's not really a show. This is just a conversation. So thanks for joining us.
Thank you, David.
So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about, I don't know, what got you here. I'm always interested in a little autobiography, having studied philosophy for so many years. I want to know a little bit about the background of the person that I'm reading, Tell me a little bit about the what and the why. So why did you wind up here and not say, oh, I don't know, in sports medicine, for instance?
I think I was always really bad at sports, so that would have been a terrible idea. But
Fair enough.
yeah, and I think I did try to avoid it. I was also a theater kid growing up, and my undergrad was in foreign languages and cultures, primarily because I got a full scholarship to study that in Italy. So I
Okay.
said yes. And then this was during Berlusconi's era and sort of neo-fascist policies. And I remember sitting in this centuries-old university discussing how to translate certain words from English and thinking this is a waste of my time. And so I went and joined the student movement, which, as someone who comes from this Yugoslav heritage, felt more sort of familiar. And then I, took a million extra exams, ended up doing political science for my master's, and I think found myself in a space where you get to ask question about why is it that everything is wrong, and how do we fix it, and what has been tried, and how do we do that further, to the point that even when I was in the United Nations and I had one of probably the most interesting jobs of essentially going around and interviewing people as a part of a team that figured out what the World Food Program did well or could do better in large emergencies. There were many more questions than answers. And then I got in touch with academics who said, actually you could just spend time reading and writing and figuring this stuff out from a different perspective. So that's how I actually started working with Adam Snade and started my PhD at Guelph, looking very much again into that intersection between politics and international development, because I think when you are growing up or are from a country that no longer exists and grows up in a very obvious context in which we need to do things differently, then it's rather a logical way forward.
No, I love all of that. I love that you somewhere along the way realized there are so many more questions than answers. I would say that that's been my path too. And I think if somebody asked me that question, I wouldn't be able to say, oh, I started doing philosophy at this point in my life. But I do think I was always much more interested in the question, because if you want to get to a better understanding or a better knowledge of another person, don't you have to ask a more refined or focused, substantive question, hopefully, right? And at some point, you do land somewhere, but isn't this about being, I think this is what the ICSDP is really all about, to me at this point at least, is it's about the dialogue and the conversation and where that's hopefully going to lead us.
Yeah, it's never a straight answer in politics or development, right? So you might as well focus on the question.
No, that's so good. There's never a straight answer. And I don't know about you, but I certainly have said things. I mean, I would call myself a postmodern, I would say, in most respects, and have been. So it's just, you're not really interested in finding out what the answer is. I've had that accusation before, and that's couldn't be farther from the truth. It's just about getting, I mean, isn't the Socratic method all about getting greater clarity? And or at least I hope it is. Well, thank you for joining me in this conversation, and I'd love to hear more about your World Food Program research. And for me, as a development practitioner over the last 25 years, it really is about boots on the ground and sleeves rolled up, and how is this making a difference in people's lives in Burkina Faso or just outside of Ulaanbaatar or Phnom Penh in Cambodia. This is what matters to me. So I'd love, maybe that's another conversation we can have down the road. But can you talk a little bit about, or maybe a lot about, your research over the past few years? And, Adam told me that you were a gender guru, and I love that. And it's fun for so many reasons, but I would love to hear some of your thoughts on that in relation to this thing called the Sustainable Development Goals and where that might be taking us with respect to not only your involvement with this group, but also, I guess, a better world. Gloria, does that make sense?
Sure. Yeah. Happy to chat about that. I do. It's kind of interesting. Every time you talk to people who are political economists, and you do gender, you end up just being the person who's working on gender. And I've always really struggled between the two because, once again, a lot of people who focus on gender get into a more of a micro level of analysis, whereby you sort of accept the broader framework in which something is located and then are looking into the specificities of the gendered relations of, in this case, the Sustainable Development Goals. And I, throughout a lot of my work, frustrated, I think, a good group of people who are, feminist institutional scholars of global governance, by essentially suggesting that a lot of the broader frameworks that we had seen over the past sort of 10 years or so before that could not have been that successful, because if they had been, we wouldn't be where we are. Right. And so I started my PhD in 2017, and in 2018 there was this report, which at the time was quite unusual for the your general UN language, in which the UN Women came out and said that progress towards gender equality was unacceptably slow, that we were essentially not moving forward and moving much, much slower than any other development related, area, suggesting that something more radical needed to change. And for me, that was incredibly validating as someone who had been kind of on the receiving end of this work from the sort of developing country NGO context, or even within the United Nations. It was so obvious that, we were trying to integrate gender in what were otherwise collapsing systems. And so when I focused on the Sustainable Development Goals, which, I remembered as, at the time, practitioner before I'd started my PhD, sitting at a desk in Rome and being told, oh, this is going to change everything. And so it sort of reminded me of these, commercials whereby they, every 6 months or so, they come up with like a new toothpaste or a new, brand of a product that everyone has been using for a very long time. But it's like, don't worry, it's new and improved, and you absolutely need this one. And so when I started looking into the question of, what is SDGs doing for gender equality that we haven't seen before? Is there a potential for us to go beyond unacceptably slow progress? I ended up really having to do a lot of that critical policy work on the SDGs as a whole, partly because at the time it wasn't as well researched, having been, sort of a couple of years old, which is not that new for academic research and publishing timelines, but also really looking at it beyond this liberal assumption that the global system is fit for purpose, which is what a lot of studies do, consciously or subconsciously. But the moment, you're asking specific questions about policy compliance, and you're asking, are these in these countries implementing it, something or whatever it is, in a correct way, you're assuming, right, that if you only implement it correctly, it will work. It's, it's doable. And that was something that really bothered me, which is why I did what a lot of people sort of found confusing, which is I looked into the systems approach to the SDGs. So I spoke to, governments of Sweden, Norway, Canada, so forth. And then I looked into the, 3 countries of East Africa that were massive advocates of Sustainable Development Goals, although rather diverse in terms of their
Mm.
own development country context. And the answer was really evident in the sense that the problem is in the global north. It's, it's not about whether or not Rwanda or Uganda or Kenya are compliant with the SDGs. It's not whether or not they are correctly or incorrectly doing their reporting or designing their national development plans. The problems are, embedded in the hierarchies of the global economic order. And so that is something that I continue to try to introduce as a discussion. If you want to talk about gender equality, then there's no way out of discussions about how power relations, and by that, I'm not going in your post-structural or postmodernist way. I'm really talking about kind of material and symbolic kind of hegemonic resources. How are those divided? Because the moment you have a very small group of actors deciding what your fiscal policy will look like because they control so much of the funding, then we really can't be talking about anything that's sustainable or locally led or decolonized or
So we're
however you want to
so
call
Gloria,
it.
we're kind of fooling ourselves in a sense until we address the more macro global economic issues. Is that a fair question?
Yes, I mean, I just don't think we can do anything other than, what people like Andrew Fisher are saying, which is go back to the structuralist discussions about who is in control of which material resources. Because otherwise, you're bound to this liberal model of charity, which we've seen comes and goes, right? So one day we're feminists, the next day, man, not so much. Maybe if we can afford it. Another day, we might get an even more conservative government. Another day, you have people like, Trump withdrawing the United States from most international frameworks. And so as long as you have a system that is so precariously held by liberal charitable attitude of a handful of governments, you will have a policy framework which de facto cannot be guided by local expertise, cannot be integrated, cross-sectorally organized, because as I explained in some of my papers that are published, is donors are using it as a menu, right? You had unprecedented level of coordination around what the SDGs are going to be. Then you have a framework that national governments across different ministries, across, different hierarchies, levels of seniority, what have you, from statistics offices to Ministry of Finance to gender monitoring offices are saying, yes, we were a part of this. We feel like it reflects what we wanted to say. We have then engaged in, quite frankly, the level of institutional and cross, governmental coordination that Canada would envy. We don't organize quite as well as, a lot of these low and middle income countries have been with the support of the United Nations, where you brought in entire sectors to think, okay, how can we design policy interventions so that if you're doing infrastructure, it's being planned alongside, let's say, extension of childcare. And when you're doing that, it's being planned alongside kind of gender equality. So you had engineers and gender officers and healthcare workers coming together to plan a system that is, kind of cost effective, in which each sector is driving support or prerequisites of the other. And then, there is no perfect policy, but you get to an admirable level of integrated strategic policy design. And then, because high-income countries decided to vote against global transaction tax or other more centralized mechanisms that would allow for financing of the SDGs, you're back where we were, in the 2000s or in the 90s, which is donor-driven funding. And then you have governments that, even some of the, well-intentioned, will simply take your national development plan and say, great, we will fund Pillar A, but you need to substitute, certain ingredients with other ones. Also, Pillar 4 does not even get funding, right? And integrated policy design, if you have certain pillars that simply don't get funding, then they don't get done. So what was the point of integrated, right, and strategic policy development? So there was a lot of expertise, a lot of international coordination, a lot of even material resources going into rethinking how development policy is set up and operationalized. That is kind of all for nothing at the end of the day, because, people sitting at our embassies, people sitting at development officers of the most high income countries are not even allowed. Oftentimes they're well aware and willing, but are not allowed to, shift decision making and resource control to local actors in ways that would reflect what is in fact the
So
document of the SDGs.
so many places that I want to go with this, and we're so not going to have the time. This is fantastic. Loving every minute of this. So are we not listening? I mean, I've thought, over the years, in development, that working on the ground in quite a few different countries, that a lot of NGOs, for instance, let's get sort of practical here for a second, come in. The classic is, they come in with the clipboard, right? With the measurement tools and the RBMs and the log frames, and isn't it wonderful? And they've got the logo on the T-shirt and so on, but they don't really take the time to step into the context. They don't take time to really listen, and I think that's changing. I do think that. Yeah. Okay. So there you go. Love to hear more
No, but
about that.
if I can
Yeah.
interrupt, it's
Please. Yeah.
not
Go.
even the first part. I don't think it's true. I don't think it has been true for the longest time. I mean, I come from the sector, I've worked in the sector, and I've done about 200 interviews, even when I was looking into the SDGs. The heartbreaking fact is that pick any decent NGO, speak to people within the United Nations, speak to people at the embassies, whether national or international staff. They are all devastatingly aware of everything that is going on. It's not, I'm sure there still are, people who are these Western cowboys of development and West knows best, but they are, as far as my experience goes, and, as far as all of these interviews that I've done, it's actually the minority of people in the sector. The vast majority of people in the sector understand precisely what is going on. The fact is, if you're working for the NGO, how is your business model organized? And, I've worked in the Canadian NGO sector as well, and I've been part of discussions around how do you localize. And for most of these organizations, there's no blueprint for you to come in and say, all right, we are going to fundamentally dismantle this organization in the next 10 years. It just doesn't work that way, because the business model is set up at the logic of growth. How do you grow? By getting more funding. How do you get more funding? You get more staff, you expand, and that is the opposite of what you're supposed to be doing if you are talking about localizing or solving some of the problems. So you're not actually designed to put the local expertise in the center. And even when you do have, policy and political will and institutional know-how, there's only so far that goes. So at the time I was, for example, doing my data collection, the embassy so our High Commission office in Kenya was working with probably one of the most well-informed, educated, well-connected, capable gender advisor in Kenya, right? And they took that step with a great dose of humility of saying, we're going to, run these things by someone who is or should be in charge. And all of that is perfectly correct. None of that, however, changes the fact that you have a foreign government deciding what will get funded when it comes to social protection in another country, right? Like,
Right. Right.
it's a colonial mechanism, and therefore it is going to depend on how much funding does Canada have for Kenya, that is a middle income country. Does the government need to go and announce that they, are investing in gender equality, or do they not? Do they need to shift the funding that are going to continue to call development, but really it's military aid to Ukraine? Is it right? So you are still essentially tied to a foreign benevolent, I don't want to say overlord, but essentially, power or
Sure, sure.
authority, right? That nobody in the country has voted for, that has absolutely no governance or any type of accountability to the local population. And so, um, then we can talk about the extent to which you can have, feminist values in international assistance policy or things like that. But at the end of the day, you're not decolonizing anything the moment you are a development agency that is allocating resources overseas.
So would it be better to not have the SDGs at all? Are we looking? So have you know, when people, I remember working with Stephen Lewis years ago, and he was asked a question about the UN, and how the UN gets criticized so much about, and I think often when people think of the UN, they're really talking about the Security Council. That's what I mean, at least, in common sort of dinner table conversation when it goes there. But what his line would always be, well, imagine a world without the UN. And I think that's an interesting response. It may be not, holistic and integrated and entirely valid today, but I do love where he's coming from there, that there's this at least sort of, I don't know, global embrace, small e, of a group of people trying to make the world a better place. I mean, are you there, or would you be more, no, let's dismantle that with respect to the SDGs and sort of maybe build, here's a better framework, here's a better way forward? Or are we still kind of at a point of, I don't know, getting our questions better, more refined, more integrated?
So just generally, I'm absolutely not for the dismantlement of the United Nations.
Neither am I, by the way.
Yeah, so I think like that's not really what I'm saying. However, in respect to the SDGs or in respect to these development initiatives, I do think it matters the extent to which we are willing to sort of assume consensus.
Mm,
And I
it's good.
think we have tried that for, as long as I've been alive. And I don't think, this past century of pretending we have a consensus has really served us. And so, because that was always the idea, right? Like, okay, we cannot agree on everything, but here are 17 objectives that, most people can reasonably agree, right? Most people can agree that we want healthy populations, environment that isn't collapsing, et cetera, et cetera. But at the end of the day, we also need to start asking questions about how we are spending our resources. And that includes obviously material resources, but I think it also involves political space in which we are investing ourselves and even some of the emotional labor, because there's a lot of emotional labor, even when it comes to bringing, seemingly non-contentious initiatives like the SDGs to life. And I think that is somewhere that I think, we have to start asking ourselves questions that also reflect the urgency of our crises. And so if we know what it means to bring something like the SDGs into reality and how much effort and resources is needed, then is that level of energy, is that level of resources really best utilized in, a forum in which we will make so many compromises to the point that the agenda on its own would not be that significant. Because when I talk to people about, okay, how are the SDGs still helpful? People will try to be as charitable as possible. They'll still say, oh, it's helpful for small NGOs to be able to say, here's what we're actually contributing, here's how we fit in the broader global agenda. Or there were significant improvements in relation to looking at disability, right? Looking into age, looking into kind of categories of exclusion that go beyond just gender. And all of that is in fact very helpful. But what happens when you have the majority of the population that lives in countries that are spending more on interest rates of their sovereign debts than on healthcare and education? At that point, are really talking about, progress or advancements that are too slow for the scale and the urgency of climate devastation, exponential rise in inequality. Oxfam International has recently issued a fantastic report that explains just how fast we're slipping away from not only anything resembling economic justice, but even democratic potential.
Hmm.
And so I think if we take a good look about uh, around ourselves and say, okay, we are staring into fascism, sort of heightened global imperialism, and increased bottlenecks across every single institutional sort of avenue that has been utilized in the past. And if we understand that that is the context in which we're working, then I think we simply do not have the privilege of getting distracted with gender mainstreaming or whatever inclusion of X, Y, and Z, or debating whether or not, a policy that involves increase in military spending is or is not feminist. I just don't think we can entertain this level of liberal fiction at this stage of planetary decay. And we need to start thinking, how do we reorganize our economies and our societies? And that is going to require more than, re-articulating the language of some of these targets.
Gloria, is this about priority? Have we got, is it completely upside down, or is it more of just, extend this little analogy here? I guess, is it just all these pieces? Is it that somebody has thrown in different pieces from another puzzle? Is that in any way helpful? And then shaken the box up and said, here you go, solve this one.
Actually, don't think so. I think there's absolutely nothing new about our crisis. We are exactly where you would expect us to be, having taken the steps that we have taken in the past 70 years. And this is what I do. Every time I teach development, people sort of stare at me on day one because I start with, the global governance architecture and I compare it to these prefabricated, kind of refugee settings that are actually designed to last, 5 to 10 years at best. Yet we have refugee camps that are standing third, fourth, fifth generation. And so what you have is these housing or temporary units collapsing onto themselves because they were never meant to last. They were very temporary solutions that someone should have fully, dismantled and redesigned something better, something more appropriate, something more dignifying. And that is also the case of our institutions, right? I mean, if we go back to even the most basic history books and we understand that Bretton Woods was expected to shift, right? The World Trade Organization has, main accords that were discussed under the hardships of the post-Walker economic world order, then you understand that actually the majority of the world was brought under false pretenses of creating a more just and more equitable global governance system. That has never occurred. Quite on the contrary, further and further institutional tools have been wielded against the majority of the world and against the majority of sort of popular interest, right? Even in high income countries. And so what you have now is simply the consequence, right, of 70 years of failed international agreements in which those that already had the resources made sure to defend the status quo. And so if you have kind of the same exact mechanism, dispossession of resource sort of use beyond any kind of sustainable patterns, imposition of Western understanding, even Western, cosmologies about who we are as people, how do we relate to one another, how do we relate to the rest of the nature. So we're exactly what you would assume us to be with, ever accelerating system of resource accumulation that seemingly has no end. And so we've reached the end in which the majority of the world cannot survive on the resources that are being kind of charitably allocated, and our environmental ecosystems are also collapsing. And so I don't think it's a particularly, surprising conclusion that so many of us are coming and saying, I don't think you can really reform development unless you take the steps that even the UN Secretary General, right, if you read our common agenda, is saying are necessary. I think you and I can both agree that 10 years ago, 15 years ago, you would never imagine a United Nations report where Secretary General says we have architecture of international finance and trade that is absolutely not fit for purpose.
How do you get out of bed in the morning with a smile on your face?
In so many different ways, because I think and this is something that I also make sure I teach. So, for example, if we look into, how the UNHCR or the UN Refugee Agency was formed, not because countries came around and said, "Oh, you know what we're going to do? We're going to make sure that no human is slipping in the cracks of the sovereign state's protection." You had a person who was going around forming friendships, using diplomatic tools, inventing a passport that was like UNHCR. It wasn't called that way, but right, that was like kind of this international passport. So essentially creating things out of thin air. And I think this is something to think about every time, you look into the horrific news and you see what is going on. We are essentially meaning making people. We come and we create completely different realities out of thin air. And while we've allowed ourselves to be led by people who I think could clinically be defined as psychopaths, the majority of us has, this innate ability to empathize and to imagine different worlds. And so um, I think giving up on the systems that are not working, or one of the Canadian, I don't know exactly what his discipline is, but I think global governance scholars, Radoslav Dimitrov, who's I think at Western, calls them hollow institutions. And he says these are institutions that not only are not serving their purpose, but they're also wasting so much of our energy. Then a lot of us who have sort of left the sector or who are speaking out and saying this might not be the best use of our time. I don't think any significant progress can be made at these diplomatic tables. We're not doing that because we've given up. If you're giving up, you're going to go and be a CEO of Save the Children and just do the same thing over and over and wait until you retire. I think a lot of us who are speaking about different systems or different alternatives are doing it from a great hope or place of kind of that radical optimism.
Radical hope. Yeah, that's where I went. Yeah, no, I think it's brilliant. I love the way you said in so many ways. In so many ways, I get out of bed with a smile, and I think so. Is that and we're going to wrap here in a couple of minutes, I think, Gloria. But am I hearing you that human component, rooted in community, rooted in a shared understanding of others, is that sort of what you're talking about? That these things creatively come out of that? I don't know. Can I make a bit of a leap here just to bring back the ICSDP into this? This group of people with different ideas, different opinions, different backgrounds coming in with lived experience to say, this might be a better way forward. I mean, isn't that sort of what this group of people are about? This community of people, this community of academics, largely, I suppose, but still, to this. Yeah, I don't know. I want to get to that relationality that I think I hear you talking about.
Yeah, and so I think the reason I keep insisting that the crisis that we're currently facing might be more urgent than the ones in the past, but it's not new, is precisely to bring up the fact that this is how the pillars that are, however imperfect, but that are there, that we do have around international law and around internationalism more broadly, they were essentially brought forward by people who were also devastated, right? People had just fought wars of anti-colonial independence, anti-fascist struggle across Europe. You had people who out of that devastation created different realities based on these discussions around what do we know is not going to work? What is it that we can take as lessons from the past? And what is worth still trying? And I think this is something that we simply don't have other choice but to engage in. Past generations have done so. It is now our turn to do so. And you don't get
Where does maybe we can wrap here too. I was reading an article recently, And I don't know, 30 years ago, I was reflecting on the work of Michael Polanyi and this idea of tacit knowledge. He wrote a book called The Personal Knowledge. And out of that, for me, came this idea of epistemic humility, this idea that you needed to step back. And I think it's connected to my question about listening, because I really, on the ground, have seen that sort of in the China shop approach from a development perspective. And I'm glad to hear that your research is finding that that's maybe, what did you call them? The cowboys of Western development or something. Hopefully that is going way to the wayside. But I wonder, this idea of coming in with obviously well-formed ideas, lived experience, research, but a humility that says, okay, that's new information. That's new. How can we make sense of that? Is that fair? Does that sound about right to you?
Yeah, no, and actually what you're talking about reminds me of Eileen Grable's work, who then on her end built on Hirschman and the idea of possibilism. And there's a recent chapter she co-wrote, and as a feminist, I only remember her name and not of the men who co-wrote it with her. But essentially, they,
And
I'm just
feminists
joking, I just
everywhere are standing up and applauding right now. Yes.
But essentially, she quotes Hirschman and saying, aren't we interested in what is barely possible instead of what is most plausible? And so I think, they talk exactly about that, going out of this idea of kind of this economic, because economists love to predict things with great certainty, and then
Sure,
they are
sure.
proven wrong and they just turn around and say, never mind, let me give you another prediction, and so it's this set of catastrophes brought forward that are suggesting actually that type of, as she's saying, also epistemic humility, to just be more open and to be a little bit more sort of possibilistic instead of
Yeah, it's
deterministic,
good.
to say this might not fully work, but based on these and these parameters, it's worth trying. And then as you're trying, it's easier to course correct when you're not assuming that you
So,
are
so,
entirely correct, right?
so barely possible rather than plausible.
Most plausible.
Most plausible. Yeah, it's great. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think I see it. I see it everywhere. I see it as a teacher. I see it as friends of mine who are entertainers, politicians, teachers, librarians. I mean, if we can somehow, I don't know, what's the metaphor? Lean back in our chair and smile at the others or the in the room, and allow space and be inclusive. I don't know. It sounds a little idealistic to me, but boy, I think that's the world I want to work towards. I really do. And Gloria, thank you so much for this conversation. I feel like,
Yeah.
again, we've barely scratched the surface. I say that all the time with my interviews. Great conversations are always unfinished. I feel like I'm looking forward to meeting, and thanks for being a part of this, and also this early iteration of the ICSDP. Last thing before we go, if you don't mind, what do you think in your mind, idealistic if you like, the ICSDP could bring to the greater conversation here ultimately as they continue to look for support and funding and so on?
Well, I think, I fully agree on this understanding of the importance in which epistemic humility needs to be just imbued into everything that we do. But at the same time, sometimes, and maybe this is my kind of structuralist bias, sometimes I think that we're slipping into relativizing everything too much. In development, in practice especially, everything is constantly reinvented. And you'd be surprised how often you speak, even with development scholars or long-time development practitioners who are not aware of what has been done in the past. And so I think um, outside of kind of bringing in a group of very arrogant academics who think they know best, I think there is a value of bringing together a set of scholars who have sort of masochistically spent the past decades or more reading everything there is to know about this, so that we know what has been tried, we know what has failed, we know why, and so we're able to engage from that perspective of what can we do now that we know everything that we could have possibly kind of compiled. And I think the group will need to be very careful about the epistemic bias and the extent to which different types of knowledge is considered. But I do think there is something absolutely urgent about engaging from the perspective of that more holistic and academic, and therefore not so kind of potentially co-opted or instrumentalized point of view, because sadly most of the sector is working with both their hands tied. So I think there's quite a bit to be gained from bringing together academics who have no interest in this other than making sure that all of this research that we so worryingly produce is actually acted upon.
There you go, acted upon. Maybe that's the title of this interview, Gloria. Dr. Gloria Novović here. She's with the School of Government at King's College in London, and it's been a pleasure getting to know you and having this
As well.
conversation. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you, David.